everyone, we'll just give it a minute and then we'll get started. All right, so we have a massive program today, so I'm going to jump straight into it. Thank you all so much for coming to our webinar, Digging into Soil Carbon. I'm Tani Burgess, the Carbon Farming Outreach Program Coordinator, and this webinar is the first of 5 across 2025 as a part of our Carbon Farming Outreach Program. Working together with Agriculture Victoria and the 10 CMAs, the program's running events all across the state to assist Victorian farmers to understand their emissions and the benefits of carbon farming. We have an incredible panel of experts joining us today, with Cassandra Schefe, Ellie Court, and Grant Sims here to answer your questions around soil health and carbon. So let's jump in. I want to start today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which the work of Landcare Victoria occurs. We are inspired by the legacy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as this land's first custodians. And today I'm coming to you from Naarm on Wurundjeri country and pay my respect to elders past and present. As a few housekeeping points, you can ask your questions to our presenters at any time through the Q&A function. I know we're going to have a lot of questions too, so getting them in early will mean you're more likely to get them answered. You can also upvote or comment on other questions, and my colleague Anna is here to help us keep on top of all of that. But first, let me pass over to our first speaker, Dr. Cassandra Schefe. Cassie is a co-owner of AgriSci and is a soil scientist with over 25 years experience in identifying and addressing soil constraints in agriculture. Her experience spans from synchrotrons to soil pits with specialised experience in carbon chemistry. Cassie works with farmers, industry, academia and government, including contributing to the Cool Science Initiative in the principal scientist role. She's authored over 22 scientific journal papers, numerous conference proceedings, and currently holds an adjunct position with Charles Sturt University. She's accredited as a certified professional soil scientist by Soil Science Australia and is a FERT Care accredited advisor. In 2019, Cassie was awarded the GRDC Recognising and Rewarding Excellence Award for the Southern Region. Thank you so much for giving up your time tonight, Cassie. I'm going to pass over to you.
Thank you, Tani. And just checking volume's good.
Yeah, that all sounds great.
And screen is sharing. Is that?
All looks perfect. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks very much. All right. So let's get into some, I was going to say nuts and bolts, but probably dirt and clods as far as the soil carbon story goes tonight. So tonight we're going to work through just a lot of the basic kind of 101 stuff around healthy soils, what soil carbon is, how we can support soil carbon in our systems, and then towards the end, touching on emissions and sequestration as one of the key kind of topics of interest or confusion in a lot of our communications today, and then just finishing off with some notes around soil testing and how we can get the most out of that. So just before we start, just wanted to take a moment to just reflect on some differences between our native systems, and knowing that a lot of our land care audience tonight is more focused on a lot of our primary ecosystems compared to what our agricultural systems look like. And this is really important when it comes to our expectations around what we can do with our soils and our soil carbon. So when we think about sustainable native systems, we're looking at cycles. If we're thinking about forests that are intact, or bushland, what's grown there then actually dies there as well. So we really are talking about the food web and about the cycles that happen in natural systems. In comparison, in our ag systems, we're very much looking at product removal. So in comparison to our native systems, where all plant material is recycled at the point of growth, in our ag systems, there really is around that product removal inputs and outputs approach. So something to think about when we're thinking about sustainable agricultural systems, we're not talking about cycles, we're actually talking about inputs and exports, or inputs and outputs. What's important then in terms of thinking about sustainability is really to say that for agricultural systems to be sustainable, we actually need to be able to balance our inputs and outputs rather than relying on inherent or in situ cycling as we would in our native systems. So then when we think about a healthy soil, there's three things that we'd be looking at. And this is something that we've all been familiar with for a long time. Looking at what's good physical condition, or our physical parts of our soil system, our adequate chemical conditions. So when we think about chemistry, a lot of that is around thresholds. So do we have adequate chemical environments to enable everything to grow? And in terms of our microbial community, we're really looking for that diversity and for those populations to be intact in our soils to be able to do their jobs. Tonight, we're going to focus on the soil physical and chemical aspects of soils, knowing that that's kind of the house, or sets the conditions in which our microbes function. In turn, while increased microbial activity can enhance our physical condition, we can't change our soil chemical properties with microbes. So we're really looking at our chemical and physical parameters to set up our soils to work well, to then enable the microbes to do their job. A key element that will come back to you later is, in terms of soil management, measuring and understanding what's happening in our systems is really important. As if we can't measure it, it's hard to then be able to manage it and understand what's happening. The other aspect of that is, if we don't have measurements in place, we don't know if things are improving or declining over time. In terms of our expectations, and I'll talk a lot about managing those expectations, it's really around managing the soil that you have. And while Victoria has lots of great things, one of the things that is more challenging is the diversity of soils within our environment. So these 6 soil pits were all taken within a 100k radius. So just to show the diversity that's occurring in very small areas. And just to explain kind of some of the challenges that we're working with is, if we're looking at the clockwise up in our top left, this soil has a really high sodic or dispersive layer. Just in that kind of just below the surface there, you can see that white bleached area. The next soil pit looks the same, but this is actually a layer of sand between 2 layers of clay. Looks the same, very different properties. Moving down, we have a very deep sand, so pure sand down to below 1 metre. Moving along to more of our classic duplex soils, light on the surface with some chemical issues as well, and then a very dramatic contrast to a heavy clay. Then we've got our classic grey vertisol, or a heavy grey clay, and our red clays that have a lot of the same properties as our grey ones, but a little bit more gradual in the increase in clay content. So when we think about soils, obviously we've got so much diversity in our soil types and systems, it makes sense that our approaches to managing those soils also has to be quite diverse. So I live in Rutherglen, in the wine, I could say the wine capital of Victoria. And as such, wine barrels, thought there was a bit of, bit appropriate there. And what we're going to talk about is really about the law of the minimum, or really understanding what's the key constraints in our system that's stopping those soils from being as healthy and functional as they can. When we think about a leaking bucket or a leaking wine barrel, it really is where the lowest hole is that's actually going to limit the whole system. So whatever is limiting the most is constraining everything else. So a key aspect that is highly important in most of our agricultural systems is soil acidity, which I'll flag again in a sec. But just as an example, if soil acidity was in our system, that becomes the most limiting factor for plant growth. We can apply as much fertilizer we like, as much water as we like, but until we address that core fundamental constraint, we're never going to improve that system. So again, measuring things to understand where things are at to is really important in terms of understanding where you need to focus your energy and potentially your investment to do the most good. So on a broader level, thinking about our house and about our physical and chemical parameters or our properties, how can we set things up well? And so here's a list of both the physical and the chemical parameters and the likely constraints that occur in our systems that we need to be looking at to see if there's a way that we can improve them. In terms of our physical properties, the key aspect and the fundamental driver of our soil physical condition is our soil texture. So our clay content, if we have more sand in the soil or more clay in the soil. Very simple, but fundamentally important because that will set the context for everything else that we can do with those soil systems. Our soil structure and infiltration and plant growth is obviously then another important aspect that we can improve on. Compaction and pugging is one of our constraints, particularly in our high rainfall zones or in our intensive animal systems, such as our dairies and other areas where we do have that, really heavy winters, wet winters, such as kind of southwest Vic and up into the valleys. Waterlogging obviously makes sense if we don't have oxygen going into the system, that's causing issues. And we need to know if that waterlogging is due to kind of a transient, just a layer on the surface that isn't moving, or it's the whole profile, which is kind of saturated. The next one is sodicity and dispersion. And I put this in both physical and chemical lists because sodicity as such is a chemical property, but the impact of it is on the physical structure. So if we have a lot of sodium on our exchange of our clays, that results in very poor soil structure, dispersion and crusting, which is a soil physical issue. And that's something we can see in these Petri dishes down on the left, where we've put a clot of soil into water. And if the soil gets cloudy, that's how we can tell if there's a lot of dispersion in the system. Slaking is a similar property, but doesn't result in cloudiness or crusting. It actually results in poor structure under wet conditions and poor ability to, slaking soils are those that we don't want to be deep ripping or making significant changes to those deep soil conditions. In these green bowls in the middle, the soil on the left is one that is slaking, so it's lost all its structure. And the one on the right is one that's slaking and dispersive. So it's lost its structure and it's cloudy. So this very simple test of putting a clod of soil into some rainwater in a bowl is something that anyone can do to see how well that soil structure is intact and is able to deal with different conditions. In terms of our chemical properties, cation exchange capacity, or CEC, is the equivalent of our soil texture. So as our clay content increases, so our CEC increases. So that's a way that we can quantify that clay content. And knowing that, that means that we can understand how well that soil will buffer nutrients or how well it will actually interact with it will be driven by acidity or other soil conditions. So the fundamental thing to understanding our soils is, again, a clay content. pH and acidity is fundamentally the massivest, I'm a professional, I use big words. The biggest issue we have in all of agricultural soils in Australia. This is something that we're not paying enough attention to. And it's something that we used to think acid soils were kind of a part of on a map and not really a big deal. What we're finding is that every agricultural soil is on the way to acidification because all agricultural production systems are acidifying because we're exporting or removing all the material from the environment, which is high in alkali. So all our plant matter through our grains, our hays, our wool, meat, milk, everything we take off is high pH, which means that we're having a net acid impact on the environment. So if you don't remember anything about carbon tonight, which we'll delve into shortly, think about if you're a land manager in any environment and you don't have a pH test to show that your soil is not acid, assume that it is, particularly actually through most of Victoria, really, consider that. In our Wimmera environment, over towards the west, our heavy clays are holding back our acidity, but even our heavy clays are becoming more acid. And up in the Mallee, we're also starting to see acidification come through. So if you don't have a test to say that your pHs are fine, assume that you've got a problem, fundamentally. So if you don't remember anything about carbon, just remember to go and get a pH test done. The other issues that we look at are salinity. Obviously, high salt content in our soil water is always going to be an issue, particularly where we've removed deep-rooted perennials from the landscape. Again, sodicity and dispersion, which I talked about before. And finally, the nutrient aspects, so ensuring the fertility in the system. And I'll talk about why fertility is so important in building organic matter and carbon in our soils. If we don't have enough nutrients to support our plants and microbes, obviously that's an issue. And under certain pH and nutrient environments, we can get toxicity coming through. So aluminium and potentially manganese in our low pH environments, and then particularly boron into our high pH environments. So these are all the things that could be the most, the leakiest part of our system, or the lowest hole in our wine barrel. All right, so let's get on to carbon now that we've done our background on general soil stuff. And let's really look at where carbon sits in terms of our cycles in our farming systems. And look, at full disclosure, focusing on agricultural-based systems tonight, but appreciating that there's a lot of land management that may not be as kind of intensive as what we'd see in some of our food production systems. So basically, we think a lot about carbon, and we either think of it as it's in the atmosphere or it's in the dirt. But in fact, it does go through cycles just like everything else does. When we think about it, we've got the CO2 or carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The key way that gets into soil is actually through the plant. And we'll come back to this a bit more. Something we don't really tend to think about. We just think about soil in, carbon in soil, and it's in this black box, and that's all great. But the plant is actually the key driver of that whole system. So that's fundamental, photosynthesis. From that point, the decaying plant material and root matter then break down into different pools of carbon in our soils. And all that breakdown process is all driven by microbes. This is really important because then microbes, a lot of them in our soil, like us, they breathe in oxygen and they breathe out CO2. So the more microbes you've got in the system, the healthier your soil is, and the more CO2 or carbon dioxide they're releasing back into the atmosphere. So it really is this conflict that we want soil carbon in our soils, but we want lots of microbes. When we have lots of microbes, we have lots of loss of CO2. So that's again something we'll come back to in a little bit. In terms of our other sources of CO2 into the atmosphere, obviously there's other respiration processes, and methane, which is produced by ruminants, then gets converted into CO2 eventually, and we've got our other products coming through. And of course, the other way that we have carbon moving into our soil is through the fecal material from animals, which is treated similar to plant litter in that it's broken down by microbes on the way through. So let's go back to that funky, ag-techy, brand new shiny technology called photosynthesis, the essential and fundamental ag-tech of the world. And it's really about how that breaks down, so it brings in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and creates glucose and oxygen out of that within the plant. Now, once that happens, we have a plant, tick, then microbes break down the dead plant material and break it down into organic matter. Then those microbes die, they're eaten by other microbes, and as the molecules of breakdown continue, those carbon compounds in the soil get more and more refined, I guess you'd call it. They split in more and more into different types of carbon into our soil environment. So if we have a net accumulation of carbon through that process, we can say that carbon from the atmosphere has been captured or it's been sequestered into soil. Sequester is just a really fancy word for carbon capture into soil. Now I said if. So as I've mentioned, Microbes like us, a lot of them, breathe in oxygen, breathe out CO2. Under certain conditions, microbes also breathe out nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas, and other greenhouse gases as well. So this is not a perfect process, because if it was, we would have soil carbon building up all over the world. And in fact, we don't. And that's the problem, is that this is a very much a dynamic cyclic thing. And by having microbes in the system, we're converting a lot of that carbon that's created from plant litter. We're burning that off back into CO2 in the atmosphere. But the fundamental thing to think about through this is that soil carbon is not the be-all and end-all of our system. Soil carbon is actually a product of a system. It's like I was going to say the rubbish at the end, but that's not right. But it's what happens when everything else works well. It's not a driver. So rather than focusing on improving soil carbon, if we focus on improving our plants and how our plants interact with our soil, then the whole system actually ramps up itself. So we'll talk about that a bit more. But let's delve down even deeper into what soil carbon actually is. And when we think about it from a very much a cultural or emotional context, we think about soil carbon obviously within organic matter, and we think about organic matter as that brown material in our soils that we can't discern where it came from. When it's broken down to the point we can't see the leaf material or anything else in there. That's kind of what we think of as organic matter. Some people think of it as humus. What we don't think about is that soil organic matter is not just carbon. It's actually comprised of all these other elements as well, which makes sense because when we think about any plant material, it's not just kind of all these dense packed carbon compounds. Any biological material is comprised of a whole lot of different nutrients. That's why we need nutrients when we eat food to actually make us grow and live. Just like our plants, they need a balanced diet of their nutrients as well, which then moves into that broken down material. So what we know is that within organic, the carbon in our soil, anything that we'd call organic carbon, comes from organic matter, except for things like charcoals and chemical compounds of carbon in our soil, such as carbonates. We also know that soil organic matter has a very consistent ratio of these nutrients, and carbon in soil cannot exist without these other nutrients, which is a really core concept in terms of how we look at maintaining and building carbon. If we wanted to drill down even more into what carbon looks like, we could look under X-ray microscopes and that and see all those different really minute broken down materials. That is what we'd call, in this case, our particulate carbon, or our readily decomposable material. If we wanted to drill down even more, we can actually see what different carbon compounds look like on the surface of clay material. That's pretty funky that we can actually kind of pick out where our different types of functional compounds of carbon exist within our systems. So I mentioned that organic matter is comprised of carbon and other nutrients, and they're within existing and consistent ratios. Now, the reason why we initially started measuring carbon in our soils rather than organic matter is that we can measure carbon because carbon is an element. And as such, we have elemental analyses that we can do. Organic matter is this broad mass of material that comprises all these other nutrients. And so if we were to measure organic matter, we actually can't measure it in a very highly analytical and consistent way. But we know that because there's these very strong ratios of carbon to everything else in our systems, we've been able to come up with kind of a rule of thumb around how we look at organic matter. So on any soil tests that you get from any of the NADA accredited labs, they'll measure organic carbon as an element, then they'll multiply it by 1.72 and then report an organic matter content number. And so it's really important to think that anytime that you look at organic matter numbers, it's an approximation of what's there. It's the carbon number that's actually being measured. Now, I talked about these consistent ratios of nutrients. We'll come back to this in a sec as well. But a key biological driver in our system and a key ratio that drives a lot of our biological activity is a carbon to nitrogen ratio. In stable organic matter, we talk about a 10:1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. Sometimes this is reported as like a 12:1, but it's fundamentally kind of there's, let's say, 10 units of carbon per 1 unit of nitrogen. And this is for stable organic matter that has already gone through that initial breakdown process. So let's then talk about why particularly nitrogen is so important when we're thinking about carbon. So just as an example, and I've said that we can't have carbon in our soils by itself. It needs to be there with all these other nutrients. What we know from some long-term studies around the world, and this is just an example, there's a lot more others, but we know that if we have no nitrogen being inputted into an agricultural system, our soil carbon number, and this is our soil organic carbon numbers on the left-hand side in megagrams or tons per hectare. This number is constant from about 1984 through to 2010. When we start adding nitrogen into that system, again, this fundamental ratio piece where we need nitrogen to build carbon, we start to get a slight increase in our carbon numbers. As we build more nitrogen into the system, that increases our ability to build carbon in our system. So that's just as an example of the key fundamental importance of nitrogen in maintaining and building carbon. The other thing is that it's not just nitrogen. As I've said, there's these key ratios with other nutrients. And this was some Australian work done out of CSIRO. Again, this work measured all these soils across the world and measured the elemental concentrations. First of all, again, we've got this really strong relationship between soil carbon and soil nitrogen. There's also a relationship with soil phosphorus. Now, this is a bit less clear because of the difference in analysis methods that's used for phosphorus, and because phosphorus being something that is drawn, is chemically bound in different soil types, but the relationship is still there. And again, with sulfur, as we increase our sulfur content, we can increase our soil carbon content. So fundamentally, we need to have the other nutrients, we need fertility in the system to be able to build carbon. So we need our fertility. The other thing that we need to think about, and we've already talked about this a little bit, is that soil organic matter, as the home or the host of carbon in our systems, is in this continual state of flux. And also, most of the benefits we get from organic matter in our system, so we know if we have increased organic matter in our soils, that will improve our soil structures, improve our soil water holding capacity and infiltration, improve our ability to hold nutrients and supply nutrients to the plant. It will improve our biological activity function, and it will also improve a lot of our long-term kind of resilience of those systems. We know all these wonderful things that come from organic matter, but they come from organic matter because it's decomposing. It doesn't happen because it's a static thing. So what we like to think of carbon and organic matter in our systems is like this black box. And in fact, you could joke that we just put a dollar sign on it and tie a bow around it and kind of put it on a shelf somewhere. It's actually this dynamic kind of, think of mini hamster wheels going around. Like, this stuff is firing so quickly, particularly in our agricultural systems where we've got inputs and outputs all the time. And in our irrigated ag systems, it's even more cycling more and more rapidly because we tend to have water in our systems and moisture when we have warmth. So this stuff is just going nuts all the time, breaking down all the time. And we're bringing in oxygen and our microbes are breathing out CO2. So the decomposition and the breakdown, or the death of organic matter, if you wanted to be really dramatic, is actually what gives it all the good things in our systems. Now, this looks a little bit of a crazy graph or a crazy diagram, so just bear with me. But this is actually the answer to a lot of questions that I get asked by farmers all the time. And as Tani mentioned, I've been doing dirt stuff for a while, and I get to hang out with some really cool farmers all through the country. So the number one question I get asked every time I talk about carbon is, I'm doing everything right. Why aren't my numbers going up? I'm retaining my stubbles and my residues. I'm retaining my ground covers. I'm maintaining my fertility. I'm managing my constraints. I'm doing everything wonderfully. Why aren't my numbers going up? Now, this is very much contexted within the ag system, okay? So we're talking about a production-based soil here. So let me walk it through and we'll see if it makes sense. So remember I mentioned the carbon to nitrogen ratio of 10 to 1? That's the key element of this. Let's say this year we've gone out and measured our soil carbon and it's at 1%, just to keep the maths really simple. Okay, then we've grown a crop through that year. Now, any of the farmers listening will know the terms nitrogen mineralisation or mineral N, or kind of N release over the growing season. And this equates to that nitrogen that's tied up in organic matter that breaks down through that growing season and becomes available for plant growth. We tend to estimate N mineralisation through the growing season as between 50 and 100 kilograms of N per hectare, subject to where you are, your soil types, and your rainfall. So let's say that over that growing season, we've had conversion of organic nitrogen to plant available, or mineral N, we call it. And let's say that we had 100 kilos of mineral N becoming available to the plant. So this is nitrogen that's in the form of either ammonium or nitrate, and is it's released through breakdown of organic matter, and it's taken up by the plant. Now, according to this ratio of 10 to 1 carbon to nitrogen, if we're releasing or breaking down organic matter to result in 100 kilos of nitrogen for plant use, that actually means that we're losing up to a tonne or 1,000 kilos of carbon as CO2 to the atmosphere because of the breaking of those carbon bonds to release that nitrogen, and the release through microbial respiration of CO2 to the atmosphere. Now, if we're not replacing any of that, would actually result in an ongoing depletion of organic matter and carbon over time as we continue to pull out that nitrogen for plant use. And that's something that we saw historically in our traditional farming systems, where we were depleting our organic matter through ongoing cultivation and release of carbon to the atmosphere. So that's what we would expect in our farming systems, to have that depletion. But if we come back next year and we measure at the same place and we measure our soil carbon and we're still at 1% soil carbon, that means that through that year, while we've pulled out 100 kilos of nitrogen and 1,000 kilos of carbon through that mineralisation process, we've actually brought the equivalent back in to maintain that soil carbon level. You with me? So by actually doing everything right, retaining our residues in the system, maintaining our fertility, having legumes in the system where possible, we're pulling back in 1,000 kilos or a tonne of carbon and 100 kilos of nitrogen per year. So when actually you're maintaining carbon in your system and you're producing food, so let's not forget that's actually a pretty important part of farming, right? We're producing all this food and we're maintaining carbon through continually bringing all this stuff back in. By default, in my mind, that's actually sustainable farming. So we have to consider the fact that we're pulling everything out of our ag systems all the time, but to maintain our carbon is actually an energetic process. So we may not realize it, but we're actually doing really awesome things just to keep those numbers the same. So it's those ongoing inputs of carbon and nitrogen into our system that are required to maintain our soil carbon levels, and we're constantly fluxing. So this is the definition of sustainability. So every time for farmers who are listening and you're thinking that you're not building your soil carbon like you would like to, if you're maintaining it, that's like a gold star effort. Amazing job. All right. The next thing is around managing expectations. So know that even just maintaining carbon takes inputs and resources, like we've just mentioned. The other caveats to think about is that each system has threshold soil carbon numbers. So our clays can hold more than our sands, and the more rainfall we have in the system, the more biomass we can produce, the more our organic matter and our carbon levels can increase. Regardless of where you are, the closer you get to your thresholds, the less carbon you'll increase per your unit input. So it's the law of diminishing returns. And all of those inputs cost money as well. Even like the nitrogen story and the fertility story, to maintain that. This also means that if you change your management to increase your soil carbon, you tend to take it to a new level, you need to maintain that increase. You need to maintain that change. If you do something new and then you stop doing it, your carbon levels will come back to the previous levels again. So for example, if you're adding organic amendments, you need to continue to add those materials. If you don't, that soil carbon will decline over time. So key factors in building our soil carbon levels. As I mentioned, soil carbon is a product of the system. So the best way to build carbon is to support good plant growth, which then also supports our microbes. And this is through identifying the constraints, both our physical and our chemical, and addressing our nutrient deficiencies or toxicities as they come through. Now, I mentioned legumes as a really key part of the system to build up that organic nitrogen bank from which we can start to pull through that nitrogen that's needed. And as we've got increased soil nitrogen, as I mentioned from that long-term research, that we actually increase our capacity to hold and continue to increase our soil carbon levels. So it's really a triple win. If we look at what's really good for sustainable plant growth, that's good for microbial function, and that's good for soil carbon levels. So within that productivity focus or that agriculture lens, if we think about identifying and addressing our key constraints or deficiencies, that then supports our optimal plant growth and diversity of those plants where possible. So increasing the diversity of crop rotation in our systems, the use of legumes, legume-based pastures, all that stuff. That then means that we get a high nutrient use efficiency and our biomass and our root production increases. That means that we can use our inputs more effectively because we've got rid of all those limitations. That then means that we've got the greatest potential to maintain or increase our soil carbon, and it gives us the greatest chance to also reduce our greenhouse gas footprint as well, which is a direct relationship with that productivity lens. So, having mentioned greenhouse gases, just touching briefly now on emissions and the soil carbon sequestration story. So think about everything that we've learnt already about the dynamic nature of organic matter in our systems, the fact it's like little hamster wheels going on, everything's kind of breaking down and being replenished all the time. Now let's think about what happens over that longer term period if we're looking to increase our soil carbon and actually kind of value add that. So how the carbon sequestration story works in terms of things like the ACCUs, which I'll raise again in a second, or any kind of carbon value piece, is let's say at time 0 or 5 years, or whenever we start to set up a baseline, we've got a certain amount of carbon in our system. Then in time, we've actually got some additional carbon. And it's that additional carbon that's actually valued as far as any carbon credits or any monetization goes. Now, we know that emissions are a key part of what we do. So we know that this bucket of carbon actually takes, we know to grow plants requires emissions as well, which I'll flag. But that total emission bucket that's happened over that period of time gets discounted from that, in addition with what's called method discounting according to soil carbon protocols because of the high error or variance associated with that. Now, talk about the emissions. Key driver of those is in our livestock systems. It's our enteric methane. In any time we're using nitrogen fertilizer, it's the manufacture of that fertilizer and the embedded emissions due to the Haber-Bosch process. If you're looking at reducing our impact of nitrogen fertilizers, we can use inhibitors or polymer coatings, and there's some really cool products coming through on the market now. But just flag with any of these, talk to the manufacturer or the people who have developed this material to see which one might be right for you and in which environment it might actually make sense. Other things that are key drivers are things like our stubble and our ground cover management. Now, just to flag the high variance we have in our systems is paper was produced a few years ago by Warwick Badgery and co-authors, which really showed that the fluxing of carbon in our environmental systems is quite high. And this is due to the differences in rainfall over time predominantly. The key outcome from this piece of work was that we may get increases in soil carbon in the short term, which may be due to higher rainfall periods, which means that we have higher biomass potential happening, and then we could get lower rainfall periods after that. So a short-term increase in soil carbon may not reflect what's happening in the long term. And this is shown over the 16 years where they've seen increases with a range of different treatments or continuous cropping, perennial pasture, everything else. And then coming into a dry period, all those numbers came down. And this was reflected very strongly in the 0 to 10 layer, which is a high organic matter layer, high microbial activity layer, and even at depth in our 10 to 30 centimetre layer as well. The other thing that has started to come through is that if our climate does warm, the ability of Australia to continue to sequester carbon as a net sequesterer may actually be reduced because of changes into the atmosphere. So again, just some stuff to show that we're living in a very fluxing environment, both in our rainfall and our climatic conditions. So in terms of the carbon credit units, which I mentioned, this is very much a financial mechanism for the Australian government to pay landholders for capturing additional soil carbon. I mentioned the additionality clause is both new carbon and new practice, so doing something new. And obviously the focus tonight is on soil carbon, but planting perennial vegetation is also a very key activity under this. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just to flag that this is as a financial package, there is a lot of legal and financial considerations there. And if this is something that you're interested in looking into, there's something called Look-See, which is a kind of an opportunity to model scenarios for your landscape to see what opportunities there might be to increase carbon. Oh, crap. Sorry. I accidentally pushed the link works. And just finally, in terms of our soil sampling and measurement, we tend to think about, oh, we don't want to do too much soil testing because it costs too much. But fundamentally, good quality soil sampling and testing is the single biggest investment that you can make to understand what your key limitations are and how to optimize your soil condition. So ensure the whole process is high quality. And this is everything from site selection, soil sample collection, soil sample handling, and down to the analysis. And just some more general comments on this. With smartphones these days, everyone has the ability to mark a GPS point. So mark your GPS points with every soil sample that you take, so then you can go back to them over time. Things like sampling at the same time of year is important. Using a NATA accredited lab and one that's also ASPAC accredited means that the analysis is high quality. And use the same lab and the same test every time. I haven't talked a lot about sampling for microbial communities, purely because of the high variability that occurs with that sampling, and then the challenge of, well, how do you manage that from then on? And just flagging that if you are interested in sampling for carbon stocks or sequestration, there are some very strict protocols required for this, including sample site selection and the requirement to measure bulk density, gravel content, and a number of other parameters. So finally, to give a reason for the GPS located sampling is this is some work we did in northeast Victoria a number of years ago, where we took a number of paddocks and we sampled them according to the carbon or the ERF protocol. And in each of these polygons or these sections, we measure the soil carbon content at different GPS points. And you can see that the percentage of soil carbon in the 0 to 10 layer does vary a lot through that paddock. If we take a transect, we're not really going to get a reflection on anything because of that variation. And because we're bulk averaging that across the paddock, we will never see an increase in that carbon over time because of all that background inherent variability. Whereas if we sample at discrete points in that paddock, then we can measure over time how that changes. And finally, Australian farmers and Australian landholders are doing some really cool stuff. So any opportunities there are to be able to report and tell our story internationally is really high value. There's talking and working with a lot of the international and the multinational corporates. There's an American or European filter that they apply to their thinking around agriculture. And so the more that we can be vocal to say, these are all the good things that we're already doing and the ways that we're looking to improve, is really amazingly valuable when it comes to, flying the flag for, the good things that Australian farmers are doing. So just to finish up, organic matter is the home of most of the carbon in our soils, and it's decomposing all the time. Because of that fluxing in the environment, increasing and storing soil carbon is never a guaranteed thing. And that farmers shouldn't have to choose between growing food and fibre and growing soil carbon. So if we focus on growing good plants, on agronomy, on efficient use of inputs, managing our soil constraints, that's also the best environment for soil carbon. And soil testing is the best way to understand and manage the soil system, to ensure that you're keeping on top of any constraints that you've got and you're able to optimise what's needed for your leaky buckets. Thank you very much, Tani.
Thank you so much, Cass. That was incredibly informative. I just want to remind everyone that you can pop your questions in the chat, and I see a couple popping in now. But I'm also just going to use this opportunity to ask my own question, which is, what's the impact on soil health from different additives like biochar or compost?
Yeah, so they're both things that get a lot of airplay. And there's some really good stuff and massive amounts of research behind both of those types of products. They actually represent kind of the spectrum of our organic materials. So our composts are really high in compounds that microbes can break down really easily. So they're very high in carbohydrates, which is like the sugar or the food for microbes, which means that when we add compost to the system, our microbial communities go up, our populations increase, they respire a lot, CO2 goes into the atmosphere, and they eat through that compost really quickly. So think of compost as like a short-term additive, or if you have a really big source of that material really easily available, that's something that you need to continually apply, because otherwise the microbes will just burn it off. So think about when you apply compost into your veggie patch, a few months later, you can't really see where you put it unless it's been at massive rates. So short-term, really cool, but limited long-term application unless you've got a really solid supply source. Biochars, on the other side, are very much stabilized carbon. So they're created when we cook organic materials at high temperatures and in the absence of oxygen in a process called pyrolysis. What that does is it actually changes some of those chemical forms. So the great thing about biochar is that it's highly stable carbon. It's very hard for the microbes to eat, and it stays in the environment for longer. But the flip side for that is that it doesn't have much it has some chemical benefit, but the key benefit of biochars are for soil structural benefit in sandy soils, because they've got a higher buffering capacity and a cation exchange. So they'll actually kind of supercharge sands, but they won't do much to the clays. But even biochars need to be added at higher amounts in order for them to do their thing. But there's high variability with those products, subject to the source material, so what was used, what was cooked in order to create that, and the kind of temperatures that it was used at. So every material is different. Like compost, there's no standard material. They're all different according to where they came from and how they were prepared. So they have value, but the challenge we have in a lot of our systems is that there's no massive sources of biochars and composts for particularly our broader acre and our larger scale farming. So the economics of biochars tend to not be there, but there's some cool research happening around how we can integrate biochars with fertilizers and other compounds to kind of supercharge nutrient availability, and other aspects at that kind of molecular level. So cool stuff, and very much the complete opposite ends of the microbially active spectrum.
Fabulous. And again, if anyone has any more questions about compost or biochar, please just pop them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar in our Q&A session. But at the moment, I'm going to hand over to our next speaker, Ellie Court, who's the CEO of Soils for Life, an organisation that works to support Australian farmers to regenerate soils and landscape. Ellie has over a decade of experience in the non-for-profit sector, working on climate sustainability research, policy, and application. So, Ellie, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Tani. I will be very quick. I'm going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then I'll hand over to Grant. Can you see my slides? Have they come up all right?
Yeah, that all looks great.
So, yeah, our mission at Soils for Life, we support Australian farmers to regenerate soils. And I know that tonight's webinar is focused on soil carbon, but I think that tends to be sort of one of the reasons way down the line for why we find a lot of the farmers we work with are looking to change their practices. You know, they're looking to build more resilient businesses, more resilient landscapes, and ultimately, you know, communities that are more functional. And so, you know, I guess reflecting on the conversation that we've just had about soil carbon, which is very interesting, I think my understanding is that supporting and improving soil health does tend to correlate to improved soil carbon, but that doesn't tend to be the main focus for us or for a lot of the farmers we work with. That tends to be a byproduct of just improving soil health for a whole range of other reasons. This is our team. I won't focus too much on that, but there are humans. We are soil scientists, agroecologists, people with experience in extension, farmers. But I would say most of all, we're an organisation that focuses on communications and trying to find ways to communicate about soil health and about agricultural practices that build soil health in ways that really connect with people. So that's our team. Our work, well, really, we're about providing resources for farmers, access to peer learning groups. Cass talked a bit about soil monitoring skills. We're doing a bit more around supporting farmers to build their own skills in soil monitoring to be able to actually get out in the paddock and observe and monitor themselves to complement what they might get from more lab testing. And we also do a little bit of connecting with governments, industry, institutions to see if we can share what we're learning from our on-ground work with farmers to inform government policy and industry and research. So that's our work. What are farmers that we engage with tend to be interested in? These are some of the questions that typically we're finding people are asking when it comes to changing practices to build soil health. And the questions like, why would I do this? What are the opportunities? What are the risks? How can I get started? Lots of questions about transitioning from a typical system, a system that they may have been using for a long time, maybe over generations, without having an impact on production for a period of time. How long does it take? What does it cost? Those are the sorts of things that we tend to be engaging with. So I just want to give you a couple of examples of the sorts of things that we provide for those of you who are farmers or who work with farmers who are listening in. These are all free resources. We're a non-profit organisation, and so you know, please go and have a look and use what works. So those of you who know Soils for Life probably know us best for our case studies. This is a case study of the Olsons in Gippsland. It's one of our older case studies. We've got now almost 100, I think over 100 case studies from right around the country, quite a few in Victoria, that tell the story of how that farming family has changed in their approach and their strategy and their management practices, what they did, the practical information about that, and what they've observed changing as a result. We've recently started doing a bit more work around practical resources. So these guides, actually the reducing herbicides, yeah, that's about to be published. These are part of a cropping focused project, so they're all sort of in a cropping context, but they provide a bit more practical information to complement those case studies, more of a how-to, I would say, although I'd caution, obviously, no silver bullets and no recipes. So they tend to provide a bit of an outline, an introduction to different practices that can build soil health that you can then adapt to your own context. This is an example of one of those guides. The guide around biological seed treatments just gives you a bit of a sense of what's in it and what it looks like on the web. You can see we've got some examples of different farmers who are using the guide. Carol and Brian Fitzpatrick are some farmers from near Swan Hill. And then, you know, as I said, a how-to. A bit of information in each of those guides about the benefits. That's from our multi-species cropping guide. This is the overview, the sort of table of contents for the multi-species guide, which Grant Sims features in. And yeah, I guess that just shows you the steps in the how-to. Each of those expands out. So this is an example of the first step around choosing plant mixes. We've got an appendix in there that shows you a whole range of different plant families and species that could be included in a multi-species plant mix, which I think is really quite useful. And yeah, as I said, some examples of different farmers who have been using that practice and how it worked in their context. This is a workshop that we ran on brewing biofertilizer and brewing biological seed treatments at that farm in near Swan Hill, the Fitzpatricks. So very hands-on. And then we're also providing a lot of online events, kind of similar to tonight. These are two different events that we ran, one on multi-species cropping with a consultant, Jay Caloran, one on integration on nitrogen management with a guy called Joel Williams, who some of you may know. We've got a lot of videos on our website and on YouTube. We provide some guides more focused around assessing soil health in the paddock. These are some results from one of the farmers in a discussion group that we host, really focused on soil health, and it shows some of those soil tests that Cass was talking about earlier. This guy is quite gold class in terms of his record keeping, so I'm always showing this. Most people are really not this organised, and you don't need to be. And then we've got a podcast as well, which you know, we've got interviews with people who are working in this space. So that's all I'll say about Soils for Life. I'll just say there's a lot of resources out there, and I think Tani is going to share the URL for that website as well, but it's soilsforlife.org.au. Now I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and hand straight over to Grant. And I'll just briefly introduce Grant. Grant Sims, he's the owner of Down Under Covers, which is a multi-species seed business. And he's a sixth-generation farmer running an 8,500-acre family cropping farm in north central Victoria. They've been utilising no-till since the early 80s, and Grant's been focused on increasing diversity, improving the life and function of the soil, specifically through biology. And yeah, we do a lot of work with Grant, and I think you'll love hearing from him. So over to you, Grant.
G'day. Yep. Thanks, mate. And yeah, thanks for having me here. Yeah, it's a big topic. I could probably talk all day about soils and carbon, but I'm going to do my best to condense it to 15 minutes. and sort of going to focus on some of the systems and principles we've used over the last 20 years and the learnings we've had with many trials and research we've done ourselves and other companies on our farm, and what we've found in terms of building soil carbon. I suppose sort of just, you know, going along with a lot of the stuff Cassandra said, like identifying, you know, soil constraints and, you know, chemical and physical, and addressing all those and having an understanding of the system. But yeah, that's where we focus on, you know, minimizing tillage, keeping ground cover, all those soil health principles. Living roots around all year round. It was maximizing, you know, living roots in your soil. So that's, you know, in pastures, that's somewhat easy if things are growing all year round. And that's why when you look at pastures versus cropping systems, they've always got a higher organic carbon because they've got more roots leaking, you know, carbon into the soil versus chemical fallows in cropping. And I suppose, you know, many years ago when we started focusing on this in our cropping paddocks, we saw that, you know, carbon was quite commonly, you know, around, you know, 0.8% to 1%. We started, you know, retaining stubbles, stopping, you know, no cultivation, all those things. And we saw it get up to sort of 2%. But then all of a sudden, you know, measuring just in the topsoil, that is, top, you know, 0 to 10, we'd have a summer, you know, rain, and we were starting to get our soils very active with biology. And I'd do, you know, what was best practice to conserve moisture and out there summer spraying and chemical fallowing. And I'd left little strips as well. And what was interesting, we started to see as the biology fired up, you know, I remember getting told years ago that carbon is the currency of the soil, and that's what all the microbes feed on, carbon. So if there's no living roots leaking carbon into the soil and you've got moisture and the right temperature and those microbes wake up, they will start eating on, you know, root matter and store other carbon like that. And that's when we saw our carbon deplete, like Cassandra was saying. And we'd see that as a symptom like what we'd call rotten stubble syndrome. So when you go out into the stubbles at the start, this time of year to start sowing, you'd kick them and they'd all snap off because there's no roots anchoring them in because the microbes have chewed them off. Where we'd left a strip where we haven't sprayed out the volunteer, you know, plants, they're leaking carbon, and we could grab the stubble around them and yank on them and they wouldn't pull out of the soil. And it was so visual. And I did videos on this with Vic No-Till back in the day, and it sort of opened our eyes. So now what we try and do is maximize those living roots. So whether we're growing longer season varieties in the cropping or where we opportunistically can put cover crops in over the summer. And then it's just understanding that in your environment where you are, you know, we're managing the rain, the moisture in our soils, because in a low rainfall environment that I'm in, I don't want to deplete my subsoil moisture, but we generally lose the topsoil moisture anyway. So we through evaporation over the summer. So we just sort of monitor that and then shut the plants down if we're concerned about losing that subsoil moisture, just to keep feeding the microbes with that living carbon. Other things we've found along the way, sort of to prime that, is animal integration and grazing management. So we've actually got a trial going at the moment. We're in our second year looking at high diversity systems where we set stock, some of it, and some of it will be, you know, high intensity grazing management. And then we've got a conventional cropping paddock next door, and then sort of a more regenerative cropping, and in measuring soil down to a metre to look at systems and management. And that's off the back of work I did prior to that. We'd done 4 years of trials with a company that had developed a fungal inoculant that when you inoculated the seed with this, it would enhance the plant's ability to sequester carbon. And through that, we did 4 years of trials with that. In the first year of trials, under our management, we sequestered the most amount of carbon in the whole project. And it was we ended up doing, I think, 7.7 tonnes of CO2 tonnes of carbon under canola crop in 9 months, from April to May. So this is measured down to a metre. When they did the cores, they were finding roots going past that metre, like with, you know, they're going deeper through that. So we've baselined our whole farm on the back of that, because we know we can sequester carbon in our cropping systems if we manage our plants well. that sort of has given me a lot of insight into how to manage them, because we're now measuring it with this down to a meter. And what we actually found last year was, I think 36% of the carbon we sequestered in those on our farm was below 30 centimeters. So that's going to stay there, and it's a lot stabler because there's always carbon cycling. But what we found in that, I suppose when most people, especially cropping, we've sort of got used to now throwing more and more stuff, inputs on to grow the crops. And the more our soils get degraded and less microbial activity, the more we have to intervene. And most of the things, in terms of, we all know legumes fixing nitrogens, and they can associate, rhizobia with those legumes. There's also nitrogen fixing microbes that can associate with any plant, grasses and wheats, which we've been brewing and playing around with and seeing we can massively reduce our nitrogen input, which is a big thing that we have to do with, in our emissions now. But it also can inhibit sort of some of that carbon sequestration process, because we've been measuring through this when we're growing our crops. One really easy way is to measure the Brix levels of our plants, which we can do in the paddock every day, like very quickly and easily. And what's interesting, most times in a cropping system, when we're growing canola or wheat and we go out with 100 or 200 kilos of urea, you go and check the Brix levels of those plants, and they're always, low, 3 and 5, and the nitrates are high. And so what we've been doing and found to really prime that carbon pump, that plant, is through foliar nutrition. And Joel, like Ali mentioned, he's got a lot of webinars and things on this, and I can go into a lot further, but we would be essentially dissolving urea, foliaring that on, and any of low elements. So like Cassandra said, we've got to make sure, if we've got mineral or nutrient balance within our plants, that'll prime that plant to photosynthesize at a higher capacity. And we've done that very cost effectively, making our own stuff or buying products out there. But for a very cheap tissue test, like you can go send a sap test or a tissue test of a plant away to a lab for about $70 and find whatever your lowest nutrient is. If you address that through foliar, it's a very cheap and easy way, because, we can try and address that through the soil, and it can cost you a lot of money and take time, because when you introduce some of those minerals to the soil, sometimes, they can get locked up with other minerals and nutrients. But by balancing it, through the foliar onto the plant, we've seen, calcium's a big one. It's very immobile. So we foliar calcium, the phosphorus, things like that, or whatever your lowest nutrient is, that'll spike the plant's ability to, like the Brix, which we can measure. And, I remember doing this years ago. We'd have plants at say 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, Brixing at that, and we'd do a well-designed foliar on it, and I've spiked them up to 26 or, 20, 30. I've rang Dr. Christine Jones about that and said, we've got plants Brixing at 20, 30 sort of percent. And she said the higher that plant's Brix level is the higher that plant's ability is to photosynthesize. So essentially now we're priming that plant to pump more carbon, and it's those root exudates and that liquid carbon, because we sort of talk about measuring carbon in dry matter, above ground biomass, and then there's the below ground biomass, the roots. That's another way. There's a lot of equations out there. You can use those figures and to calculate carbon sequestration. But if we start measuring the liquid carbon from root exudates, that's another huge way we can get carbon into our soils. And to do that, adding plant diversity, we've found is, and there's a lot of research on that, is, good for not only soil structure, but increasing, microbial population in the soil, which drives all this. So there's sort of many ways there. And then when we do have that above ground biomass, especially in our cropping systems, a lot of times we're sort of sitting at there chemical fallow, and it can either, people either throw a match in it and it's burnt off into the atmosphere or oxidized off. But we've found if we then integrate the livestock on those, even on the stubbles, they're cycling that. It goes, in one end out the other. And then if we've got a healthy functioning soil with worms and dung beetles and things like that, they can come up and feed on the manures and then bury that down quickly into the soil in forms of carbon without it getting oxidize and sequester it off. So sort of once again, it's all part of the system and the management, and you know, minimizing chemicals. Like we've found, if we can get our fungal levels up in the soil, we get a lot better cycling as well. You know, most of the chemicals and things we use are detrimental to this process, the fungicides, the insecticides, because they're, you know, fungi and insects are two big drivers to cycling and mineralizing, you know, our residues and things. So we want to drive that. Adding animals also stimulate increase in microbial diversity and prime that pump. And I mean, I could, you know, you could do week courses on grazing management, but there's very good data to say if we're grazing, if we put plants in and eat them off to the floor, you know, to the boards or the down short, we're pruning the roots and we're stopping that plant. It takes so much longer to recover. But if it's a light graze, that tugging of the plant leaf can, and the saliva off the animal and all that sort of stuff can stimulate plants to grow and facilitate and pump more carbon. It primes the carbon pump. I've seen a lot of research done, you know, replicated trials in the States where, you know, high diversity systems versus cropping, and the thing that primed it all was that animal integration and that grazing management. And so that's what we've set up now, and we're in our second year of doing that, so we can demonstrate those systems here in Australia. So another big component of it. How are we going for time there, guys?
Going all good, Grant. Did you want to keep going for a few more minutes or jump to questions?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to keep going. Yeah, so just, I suppose that to sort of wrap it all up and then we can get into questions. I think it's important for us all to know, you know, do your research. You know, these events like this are really good, and resources like Vic No-Till and Soils for Life and things like that, but understanding of what's detrimental to carbon sequestration. And, you know, if we keep throwing out big licks of urea and high amounts of that, you know, we're not going to be in a system that'll drive carbon sequestration. We need to essentially get more plant diversity and get the microbes going. It's pretty mind blowing when you start looking down that field and getting soil structure right and microbes going, what we can achieve, you know, with very little added inputs in terms of N, and still, you know, drive good production. And when we're finding that and maximizing the plant's ability to photosynthesis, that's our real job as a farmer, is to enhance plant health and photosynthesis, because that photosynthesis is what drives life and everything in the soil. So yeah, we can just focus on that. Yeah, that will, and I think at the end of the day, if you have more carbon going into your soil than going out, you're more likely to hand it down to the next generation, because the higher this, we've found every time we tissue test, or sorry, do a soil test on our, you know, if we've got cropping paddocks and this area is yielding, you know, whatever tons, it's higher versus the lower yielding areas. Every time I soil test it, carbon is one of the key things for us, and calcium's also in our clay soils, very important. But yeah, it's we just got to keep focusing on those things to drive that photosynthesis.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Grant. I'm actually going to go straight to you for our Q&A while we get our other presenters to turn on their cameras. Sorry, team. Gurnham's asking, what go-to indicators in the paddock do you use to get some ideas of how you're trending with your soil health and function?
Well, I'll jump straight in. Like, I think, you know, get to some days and there's probably clips and videos on here that will demonstrate how to do soil assessments. But something we all should have everyone have in your ute is just a shovel. And I like a penetrometer is good too. But, you know, once we started doing this like 20 years ago, I put the shovel in and you tap it in our clay soils, and the top's crumbly, and then we'd have a distinct hard pan, and then the bottom is like bricky, blocky clay. And as we stopped the cultivation, maximized ground cover and added diversity, we started to see better root development, and which then led to better aggregation. So you want that nice crumbly, like a chocolate cake looking crumb structure in there. The other thing we've found, and this is pretty wild for some, but there's things, so there's a lot of work done on fungi and biology you know, there's a big correlation to soil aggregation. And there's some high analysis phosphorus and fertilizers can kill soil biology, and then it will die, and then the soils can collapse and become compacted. So, you know, being mindful of what we're not only cultivating and keeping it covered, get maximum roots in there, but don't go too hard on big high amounts of some things that chemicals and things can really kill some of the biology that helps give that soil aggregation.
Cass, did you have anything to add to that one?
I think it's really important to I'm not disclaiming anything that Grant's saying at all, but sometimes it's just to know what your cause and effect piece is. So knowing that phosphorus is one of the, nitrogen being the only element that can actually be fixed by microbes in the soil environment, when we are lacking in other things like phosphorus, that then becomes one of those key limiters into the system. So yeah, look, happy to chat more and to learn more about some of the research in that superphosphate space. And certainly the role of phosphate as a key requirement for plant growth means that just understanding where your levels are up to and applying adequate into your system, not saying to go stupid, but that, you know, ensuring that if ever we're taking product off our system, particularly phosphorus export, we need to be replacing that. So just to keep in mind that just like us, microbes need a balanced diet as well. And the only thing that can be created by microbes in terms of nutrients is is nitrogen. And so there is a requirement to bring in the other nutrients as we need. Just to add that context.
No,
Yeah.
fabulous.
I might just chime in there to, like, I'm not saying don't use any of these things. It's just it's like anything, overuse. It's the dose is the poison, and you can stimulate the rumen of an animal with a small amount of urea or nitrogen, and it will, they put it in feed additives to stimulate the rumen. But if you put too much in, you'll kill the animal. So same with the soil, like little bits can stimulate, and but it's just being mindful not to go overboard and then start killing fungi and microbes that will do the job for you.
So, and to add to that fungi are very good at exploring for phosphorus and stuff in our systems, but I'm not aware of a lot of research that's shown that you actually kill microbes in there. But I'm just saying that we've probably been looking at different systems and different environments.
I think one thing we can all agree on is it's absolutely fabulous to start thinking about your system and getting the tests that actually give you a bit of an insight into that. Ellie, I'm actually going to pass to you with this next question. I feel like it's a question that we could have another 90-minute webinar on. Thomas has asked, what's the most effective management practice for increasing stable soil organic carbon levels in different soil types? Again, we can also just expand that to be, how would you want to start increasing organic matter in your soils to kickstart that process?
Well, thanks for that. I'm going to bat this back to Grant and Cass, but what I will say is that the approach that we tend to take at Soils for Life, as I said, is not to take a primary focus on how can we build soil carbon, and I think this aligns with what you said earlier, Cass. But how can we build soil health? And the principle that, there's some pretty clear principles about how to build soil health, soil being a natural ecosystem. And those principles align with what a natural ecosystem would be doing if we weren't intervening with it. And I think the principle and the primary rule of thumb is diversity, and looking for every opportunity to bring diversity into the system. That's the diversity of plants and diversity of organisms. And I think as land managers, and I say this not as a farmer myself, but as someone who works with a lot of farmers, the primary way we can do that is looking at the diversity of the plants that we plant and the animals that we bring into that system that we're raising. So that's all I'll say on the matter in terms of rules of thumb. I'll bat the question back to Grant and Cass to answer in the specific.
Cass, did you want to have a go at that one first?
I actually had a quick brain fade and forgot what the question was.
The question's about management practices to build soil carbon or soil health, but I think that's probably a question that's as long as a piece of string, right?
Well, it's a lot of what we've spoken about before, but a key is how do we optimize that plant system and ensure that we're able to grow good plants. So an example being, if some of the environments that have been in that soil carbon levels have been really low, and so they've applied superphosphate and other fertilizers thinking that that's what's needed to grow better plants, and nothing happened, because the key fundamental driver behind that system was acidity. So until that soil acidity issue had been resolved, then the plant couldn't actually make use of anything else in the system. So management practices that can improve plant growth, and we also know that through our long-term field research in ag over the last probably 60 to 80 years, that those rotations or those systems that have a legume in the system are the only ones that will consistently drive soil carbon levels. So because of that nitrogen component and that organic nitrogen release over time. So fundamentally, anything that we can put a robust legume into is going to be beneficial. Maintaining our residue inputs. It's, as I mentioned, anything in agriculture is a in and out job. So if we're maintaining what we're putting in, is fundamentally key. But remembering that even maintaining soil carbon levels is awesome. And we also know that when we improve our fertility in our systems, we will actually, also bump up our soil carbon levels. And knowing that, the last thing I'll add is that as part of the work that I do with the Cool Soil Initiative, we have got over 1,600 soil samples taken from Victoria into southern New South Wales, or GPS located. And as part of that, we have full practice history. And this is in cropping. And we've got cropping soils in conventional systems up to 4.5% carbon. Those cropping systems, and what we know from those high, those soil carbon levels above 1.5% and above 2%, is that there's a strong correlation of those with those that have a legume in the system, that their pHs are not limiting, and they're highly productive. So they're growing lots of plants, lots of biomass in our systems. So focusing on just getting the basics right to grow a really good plant and a legume, manage your constraints, do everything that we've talked about for the last hour or so, and you've got a good chance. But knowing that we're dealing in fluxing dynamic systems. So we're never going to get a beautiful increase over time.
Yep, I'd back that up 100%. And I know for myself, exactly that, the soil acidity and sodicity can be if those are way out of whack, you're going to have trouble growing any sort of plants and roots. So, addressing that, calcium is, I think, one of the biggest underrated things in those situations, to get in and flocculate the soil and get roots growing. And the basic fundamentals I found, biggest changes in soil structure was just keeping that ground covered, control traffic, minimizing compaction and minimizing disturbance like cultivation, and then facilitating as much roots as you can. And that's what you'll drive everything, the soil health and carbon.
And Grant, just with the calcium that you're talking about calcium sulfate in that instance with gypsum application for sodicity?
Yeah, we did. Yes, a bit of both. We've done a bit of liming and a bit of gypsum over the years, and we've also done some liquid calcium into the root zone. And that actually was a really good one. We had some highly sodic soils, like 16% sodium, and we were injecting liquid calcium at like 10 litres a hectare, and just not enough to correct soil balances and deficiencies, but to sort of buffer around the roots and facilitate more root growth. And then I sort of found that I was sort of hell-bent for a few years on just getting lime and gypsum and all that out. But the more roots we got in, some of those soils completely changed structure and the way they were with paddocks around them, just by injecting liquid calcium in and trying to get more roots growing. But those particular high sodic soils is very important to keep. If we cut them for hay and we had a dry, hot summer, they would bake down hard and be no good. So we run a stripper front so we can maximize our stubble cover, and we don't I nearly cry when I see stubbles getting burnt, because I work so hard to keep that mulch. It's that we all do it in the veggie garden, mulching mulching is so good for our soil, and the stripper front helps us with that, and the disc seeder, it's all part of the system to do that. But yeah, calcium sulfate or gypsum is probably, a general go-to in your sodic soils is very good to flush it through. But there's some really cool work I've seen Elaine Ingham and that do around that, and adding bacteria, adding fungi, and adding organic matter in those situations. And the more fungal levels you have, higher they are in the soil when you add the gypsum and lime, the more you'll hold on to that calcium and have stopped that from leaching through as well. So there's some really cool stuff happening around when in soil fungi and things like that. And some of the most productive soils are higher in fungi.
Well, the beautiful thing about gypsum is it actually displaces the sodium from that clay exchange. So it's not so much the calcium leaching, but it's actually displacing and then improving population and structure. So just to confirm, for those in the cheap seats, that of the 2 calcium products that we use a lot in our systems, we've got gypsum and lime. Gypsum being calcium sulfate, lime being calcium carbonate. They have 2 very different modes of action. So anytime we're talking about soil structure or dispersion, crusting issues, any of that physical piece, that's something where it's the calcium part of the calcium sulfate in gypsum that does the job. When we're talking about liming and pH adjustment, it's the carbonate part of the calcium carbonate in lime that actually does the job on that. So we tend to, people are going to get a bit confused thinking, oh, can I just use gypsum for one or the other? Can I just apply gypsum and do both, or apply lime and do both? But we tend to, horses for courses, to just, and whichever one you're using, just use the best quality product that you can to do either of those 2 jobs.
The other thing I just was saying when we're looking at soil indicator, talking about a shovel, I love a penetrometer. Like, I carry one of those and checking paddocks all the time around, and it's good to know, we could say in July or August or whatever, and when you can start pushing the handle like we can on pretty well over our whole farm, push the probe all the way to the handle with one thumb instead of 2 hands, you've got your soil structure starting to improve and getting roots in. So it's another good one. And I'd encourage people to get out and push it down, and then you might find it sort of gets really tight or hard at 400 mil or 600 mil or whatever. And that's when you can do a soil pit and look down at that depth layer and what's going on there and test it. And it can be an aluminium layer, a sodic layer, and things like that. But that's where we've found in some of those constraints in those layers, the more plant diversity, because different plants have the ability to tolerate different levels of minerals and nutrients. So I think plantain will tolerate a lot higher levels of aluminium. So if they're in the mix, they're leaking carbon into that aluminium layer where other roots get pruned off and burnt from that aluminium. They start to dilute it with the carbon they're leaking, and then it starts to tap in and other roots can go through and start to unlock soil. So there's lots of, we could talk all day, but about this, but plant diversity can be a big help too, I've found.
So the soil pits are amazing. End of the day, the root is the source of truth in our soils. So if we can actually see where our roots are going, that's giving us a very clear picture of what's actually holding back those systems or not. And generally, digging a pit, the answers tend to be pretty clear.
Fabulous. I cannot believe we've so quickly gone through our time. Speaking of digging soil pits, this is one of many Carbon Farming Outreach Program events happening across the state, including quite a few looking at soil health and soil carbon. So please make sure you visit landcarevictoria.org.au/CFOP to have a look where those are coming up near you. But before that, I just wanted to ask our panel, what would your starting point be for someone who's new to thinking about their soil health? Where would you recommend someone start, or what should their key takeaway be? Cass, did you want to go first?
I'd recommend just getting along to a few events and just seeing, what's happening out there, the work that Source for Life are doing, and other, there's all the CPOP stuff, any soil pit stuff. It's just there's a lot of terminology, a lot of things that we talk about, just getting understanding a little bit more and just taking it slow. Manage your initial expectations and just, get the jigsaw pieces together a bit before going further, and talking to other farmers around you to see what else, what else is happening.
Amazing advice. Ellie?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned before, like we've got a lot of resources. There are a lot of other organizations out there that have great resources on soil health, but I think we particularly try to focus on the entry point. But yeah, I think often visiting someone who's working in a similar context to you, a similar enterprise, a similar climate, a similar area, and going and visiting them and seeing what they're doing at a field day, that's often a great way to go. Just getting out in the paddock and taking a look at the soil, you know, taking a shovel, digging some soil up, having a look at it, doing some of those very basic tests to understand like what it looks like, and then give you a starting point to then keep monitoring over time. I would echo the point about starting slow, like jumping off a cliff to do everything, do the biggest things, do the most expensive things from the get-go is probably, you know, some people do that and succeed, often with some pain along the way. You know, that's not the strategy for everyone, I would say. Yeah, really doing your homework and then starting small or starting somewhere where it's sort of safe to fail.
Yep, I'd go along with all that. I think you know, a soil test as a starting point's good. And we do totals, like not just plant available or soluble, you know, the total locked up unavailable. Get a sort of insight as to where they're at, and total active biology as well. And then, you know, yeah, get the roots growing essentially, and maximize that plant's ability to photosynthesize. In a grazing system, or when we've got pastures and people doing that, you know, I don't know how many times I drive anywhere through the grazing country, and you never see much grass getting over a metre high. Like as soon as we've got grass, we're buying cattle and we're grazing it off. So I sort of always, you know, try and say, like, start small. We know what works, but if we want to get different results, sometimes we've got to try different things. So, but you don't want to go and implement your whole farm, and because sometimes it takes a year or two to learn new managements and your soils to adapt and build, you know, to earn the right to build structure and get biology in there. But like, you know, always very easy to put a hot wire across a part of your paddock and keep the animals off there until they get to peak biomass, which is at flowering, from when they turn from vegetative to reproductive. That's when they start trading off roots and you know, putting energy into growing seed and grain. At that point, then smash grazer and just see what that does for next year. Because if we're not growing roots down at depth, we've always got them in the topsoil. We're not going to improve, you know, our soil structure at depth. So we need roots down deep, and to do that, we've got to let the plants get big. And so yeah, just fence off some areas and just play around, do some education around grazing management, and get those tap-rooted plants and diversity in there.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. And I'm sure I'm not alone in learning so much tonight. So a big thank you to all our panelists. I'm sure we could stay on and talk about soil health and structure for another 90 minutes, but I'm mindful that we've gone a little bit over. I just wanted to say that this is the first in our webinar series for 2025. We're going to do a whole range of different topics around carbon farming. So a quick reminder to save the date, because we'll have a whole bunch of different webinars coming up across the year. And we really welcome any feedback you may have. So when you close this Zoom link, you're going to see a survey pop up. It's really, really helpful for us to be able to understand what your questions are and what information you want to know, because it allows us to actually make sure we have wonderful experts like our fabulous panel today to come along and answer those questions. But it's not your only opportunity to answer questions. And I know Cass especially is going to be at a whole bunch of different events across the state. So please make sure you check out our Carbon Farming Outreach Program event page. There's a link right there in the chat, I think, and there should be something coming up near you. If you don't see anything coming up, you can also pop in your email to register to get updates, and we'll send you a notice when there's something coming up in your CMA. So yeah, I just want to thank all of our panelists again, and thank you all for joining us on your Thursday night. We hope to see you next time, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thanks.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
Connie.
Cheers.
Bye.